Right. Hello, Q10 students. Today, uh, this week, we're talking about transportation and how transportation is linked to cities and the urban environment. Transportation is really a key subfield within urban studies and planning. And it's actually an area where there's some pretty good job opportunities working for local government organizations and nonprofit groups dealing with a number of dimensions or surrounding transportation in the urban area. We're going to focus in this lecture. I'm mostly going to be following the chapter that we're reading for this week. I think it's chapter 6 on transportation. And we're going to be looking at a reliance on the automobile. We're going to talk about the conspiracy led by General Motors to ensure that our cities were reliant on highways and the automobile. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges in creating a more intensive public transit system within our urban areas. So this is Los Angeles, something that we are all very familiar with, too familiar with. And we were in class today, I would have said, virtually everyone would have gotten to class, to Cal State Northridge by driving. And that's how most people get around. We kind of all know that. COVID, I guess, has given us a break from the highway, if there's any positive thing about COVID. So yeah, Los Angeles has 6,400 miles of roads and 160 miles of freeways. It is just a massive auto-dependent region, as are most cities in the United States. Very few cities have a public transit system that is utilized by a large share of the citizens to get around. And some places that come to mind, New York, San Francisco, Portland, they have pretty good public transit systems. It's important to underscore the importance of transit and just to remind ourselves how integrally it's related to all these other dimensions of our lives, where we work, transportation, where we work, where we go for recreational activities, where we shop, the way our communities are put together. So many things about being in the urban environment are so strongly shaped by transportation, by roads, by the automobile, by public transportation. So when we talk about urban development, really transportation is just a central issue. Now, here's a chart. This is from the chapter, I believe, that we have this week, just underscoring the percentage of people who commute to work and to other areas by the car. So pretty much 90% of the people in the United States are dependent upon the automobile, and whether it's going to work or doing other things. And I think we kind of all know that. This dependence on the automobile has increased every decade for the last 60 or 70 years. This chart here shows the percentage for 1960, 1980, 2000, and we can see certainly an increase, especially between 1960 and 1980. So things have gotten worse in that respect. So one of the questions that emerges in the debate around transportation, and especially public transportation, is why are our cities so dependent on the automobile and roads and highways? Now, there is on the one hand an argument which is very consistent with, you know, the argument that markets work well and markets should decide things. And that argument is that consumers want to drive. Consumers prefer cars over public transportation. And that is the way a market system works, is that you follow the preferences of the consumer. So it sounds like a simple idea, and it makes sense on one level, but recall how markets can not work as efficiently as the theory tells us they will. And one reason why markets sometimes don't work has to do with corporate power. Large companies, large corporations are able to use their influence to shape markets, to shape consumer demand, to limit consumer demand in certain ways, to shape consumer demands so it is consistent with their interests. And I can't think of one better example of how corporate power has manipulated the market system in its interest than the example of General Motors and the automobile transportation conspiracy. This conspiracy goes back to approximately 1920. And this is a time when Sloan, that's his last name, I forgot his first name now, it's Sloan. He was the head of General Motors at this time. And he had this idea that cities should be dependent on freeways and roads and the automobile. So let me come back to, I'll come back to Sloan and GM in just a minute. Now we got to put our minds back just over 100 years ago and to looking at transportation in Los Angeles. And a lot of people don't realize, if we go back over 100 years ago, Los Angeles in fact had a thorough, pretty well developed public transit system. There were primarily made up of trolleys and electric rail cars. Here is a map. It's a little bit hard to read. So let's see, the Pacific Electric had red car lines from downtown LA to San Bernardino, Santa Ana, San Pedro, and San Fernando. This map isn't as good. The next one is better. This map is of 1906. And if you can see some of these lines here, these were the transit lines, but this one is a little clearer. And this focuses specifically on the Pacific Electric rail line. There were 3 or 4 different rail companies, and they started out as private rail companies, and they built tracks and they built electric cars, and they charged people to use them. And so most of them were small. This was the largest one, Pacific Electric. It was founded by Henry Huntington in 1901. Some of you may have heard of the Huntington Library in Pasadena, which is this big kind of museum, outdoor kind of gardens and public place. This was built after him. He was a huge figure. He was a multi-millionaire. He was involved, I think, in the water conspiracy that we talked about earlier. He was involved in some of the early water issues in Los Angeles. That's another story. But anyway, by 1920, Pacific Electric was carrying over 250,000 passengers daily on 4,000 light rail cars over tracks that totaled more than 1,000 miles. Now, Henry Huntington was a big real estate developer, and he had an interest in developing so Henry Huntington had a big interest in building these electric railway systems out into the areas outside of Los Angeles, where he was also building residential developments, housing. So this way people could get to the housing and buy the housing. So it's pretty interesting that this was actually built through the private interest of a very wealthy real estate investor. But nonetheless, the reality was there was this extensive light rail system. This is kind of interesting here. You could get up and down the coast, right along the beach in Los Angeles through light rail. And you could also kind of get out to this area here. You could kind of get to the valley. You could get down to Long Beach and then further down. Now, most of these tracks are gone. Some of them still exist. Some of them are now being used by Amtrak and Metrolink and so on. But most of the tracks are gone. And this map here shows the Pacific Electric Railway system if it were still in existence. And this could have been the basis for a very modern and extensive light rail system for the region. Here's a picture of some of those light rail cars. They were referred to as the big red cars. And so this is a good picture here. You can see here, this is a San Fernando line. And so this goes way back. These tracks were still in place, most of them, into the 1950s and early 1960s. Here's a picture of a red car somewhere and going over what was the Fletcher Drive wooden bridge. Here's another photograph. This is not part of the red line. This was part of a different, separate rail line. As I mentioned earlier, there was a couple of different light rail companies. This is on Crenshaw Boulevard. But we come back here to our conspiracy. And in the 1920s, GM realized that there was an expanding market for the automobile. And they realized that their markets had kind of become saturated, and they saw that the country in a way was kind of at a crossroads. It could either go more towards public transportation or could go more towards a reliance on highways and the automobile. And so Sloan just saw this as a great market opportunity because you had literally thousands and thousands of people, of consumers, who would potentially need to buy cars and would be dependent on those cars. If cities went the route of promoting public transportation, that market would be significantly diminished. So GM set out consciously to undermine the light rail system in dozens of cities across the US, not just Los Angeles. The film we were watching this week is a great documentary about the GM conspiracy. And I really encourage you to watch it carefully. And so GM did a lot of different things. The documentary expands on some of those, and I'll just cover a couple of main things. The main thing that they did was that in 1936, General Motors created national city lines. And this was kind of like those corporate, ways in which you can kind of hide things. So with GM funding, they created this called a holding company or a subsidiary, and they also raised money from other companies that had an interest in promoting highways and roads, such as Firestone Tire, Standard Oil, Phillips Petroleum. All of these folks had an economic interest in the automobile and making cities dependent on automobiles. So they created National City Lines as this private company, and they did so nobody would see that GM was connected to it. They really tried to hide themselves, and they hired some people to go in and pretty much purchase the private rail companies and put them out of business. One of their main strategies was to promote buses. So between 1936 and 1950, National City Lines purchased over 100 electric surface traction systems or trolley car systems in 45 cities, and then converted them into buses, to bus operations. So you go in, you purchase the light rail system, you undermine that light rail system by cutting back services, cutting back hours, not investing in proper maintenance. And then you begin to dig up some of the tracks, literally, and replace them with buses. So the idea here is that if you're digging up the tracks, you replace the tracks with roads, and then replace it with buses. Eventually, people who are reliant on the buses are going to purchase cars. You can't go back to an electric trolley system. Now, somewhat ironically, the buses were actually manufactured by General Motors, so they've benefited in that way also. The documentary goes into this in more detail, and this is a very interesting kind of thing that happened. When we talk about corporate power, where General Motors exercise their power in very various ways to obtain this reliance on freeways and roads. Here are a couple of examples. One guy, Francis DuPont, who was connected to the DuPont family, which is a family of billionaires. DuPont is a multinational corporation. The DuPont family owned a huge share of General Motors stock. So they had a strong interest in General Motors and General Motors being economically successful and growing. Francis DuPont was at a critical time in the 50s and 60s, the chief administrator of federal highways for the US government. So he was making recommendations to the President of the United States and other high-level officials about how the US government should support the building of highways. Also, if you look on the right of this PowerPoint, is Charles Wilson. He was president of General Motors between 1941 and 1953. He retired from General Motors in 1953 and he became Secretary of Defense for the US government. So he, along with DuPont, two people with a major interest in General Motors, were at the highest levels of the US government. And Charles Wilson pushed relentlessly for the US government to fund and oversee and build a system of interstate highways. And he thought that, maintained that this was important for national defense, for US forces to be able to get around in case the United States was attacked. But many people argue the real motivation was the economic interests of General Motors. So their influence was pervasive at the top levels of government. And one of the key things that happened was the approval and establishment of the National Defense Highway Act of 1956. This was one of the most, this was a piece of legislation that dedicated billions of dollars to building highways throughout the entire country. You can see the network that was laid out in this map on the right-hand side. The National Defense Highway Act established the Highway Trust Fund. And this was crucial because the Highway Trust Fund set up taxes on the sale of new vehicles and gasoline that would go into funding highway construction. Of particular importance was the tax on the sale of gasoline. And this is actually still in effect today. So every time, since 1956 and even today, when people buy gas, you're paying some tax that goes into this fund for building highways and maintaining highways. So here's a couple of final statistics here. In 1936, there were 40,000 streetcars operating in the United States. By 1955, only 5,000 remained. And this was the work of National City Lines, again, funded by General Motors. Some of the electric trolleys in Los Angeles were set out to pasture, so to speak. This is a picture of these trolley systems that were being recycled and eliminated in 1956. They sat out there on Terminal Island, which is out by the ports, and there they were just destroyed. Here's another picture, some light rail cars being sent out to pasture, so to speak. And So General Motors, they were successful. They eliminated the streetcar and the light rail car in cities throughout the country, and they replaced that system with buses. And in addition, they created and built a network of highways and roads, which has made our cities and our population dependent on the automobile. So again, you can see how corporate power can be used to manipulate the market. If you take a look at this graph here, probably the most important thing to focus on, there's a lot of different colors here, just focus on the red color. The red color represents millions of trips per year. So in other words, the red color represents how often people are using streetcars and light rails. And the important point here is that in 1920, a lot of people were using streetcars. And don't worry too much about the numbers here, because that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. I won't ask a question on the quiz about that. But from 1920 to 1950 and into the 1960s, people no longer, the use of streetcars declined dramatically and was virtually zero by the time we hit the 1960s. So it'd be a good point here to watch the documentary, Taken for a Ride, that goes in depth into this GM transportation conspiracy. And I'll end this lecture here. I'm going to have a second lecture, a brief lecture on looking at some other problems related to current automobile dependence, and then thinking about what are some possible solutions to that automobile dependence.